Good afternoon and welcome to ALRI special event, in this case the lecture of Why Vietnam Matters. ALRI stands actually for Arlington Learning and Retirement Institute. We are thankful to the Arlington Library that they work together with us and we can present these interesting lectures. Instead of giving you a detailed bio of the author, I thought I'd read you a condensed introduction from the New Yorker from October 2009 by George Packer. Rufus Phillips was a young CIA officer in Saigon in the 1950s, a protege of the legendary Colonel Edward Lansdale. Over the next decade, Phillips became that rare thing in American policy, foreign policy, an expert in the politics of another country. Phillips got to know South Vietnamese politicians and military officers better than any other American. When the Saigon government started to collapse in 1963, Phillips returned to Washington, and though he was far down the bureaucratic pecking order, was asked to brief President Kennedy. Phillips was one of the few officials in a position to know how badly the war was going, and he and a blithely optimistic Marine general argued it out in front of Kennedy. In a scene that was made Phillips' reputation as a fearless straight talker by David Halberstam, recorded in his book, The Best and the Brightest. A couple of decades ago, Phillips started to write a memoir, but he put it aside when the publisher told him that no one wanted to read another Vietnam book. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan caused him to take it up again. And in 2009, Phillips published Why Vietnam Matters. You can find copies for sale for $20, and Mr. Phillips will sign them. And also, please now help me welcome Mr. Phillips.
Can you hear me? Thank you very much, Karen, for that very kind introduction. My talk is going to be given in three parts. I'm going to give a narrative of the story that's in the book, which covers the years 1954 through 1968, when I was involved off and on, and sometimes quite deeply on, in Vietnam. Then I'm going to talk about why Vietnam matters in terms of the lessons that I think should have come out of that war. And then I'm going to turn my attention to Afghanistan and try to describe, from my point of view, what Vietnam tells us about Afghanistan. I will, and this is the first time I've done this actually, I will illustrate my narrative with some photographs taken from that time. And I need to give you the background a little bit at the beginning, which was that I arrived in Saigon on August the 8th, 1954. It was 2 days before my 24th birthday. I was a young second lieutenant detailed to a special CIA mission that had been set up by Colonel Edward G. Lansdale, who had been asked by the President Eisenhower, and by the two Dulles brothers to go out and do what you can to save South Vietnam. The Geneva Accords had just occurred. The country was being divided into two parts. The French and the Vietnamese nationalist forces were to withdraw from the north, and the Viet Minh, which became eventually the Viet Cong, were to withdraw from the south, that is, withdraw their regular forces. And this was a time of complete turmoil in Saigon. There was a Vietnamese nationalist government under Bao Dai that also had its capital in North Vietnam. So that whole government had to come south. And there was no government in the South except for the remnants of the French colonial government. And so, in effect, Vietnam was, if there was going to be any kind of independent South Vietnam, it was going to have to start from scratch. President Diem arrived shortly after Lansdale first got out there. And he confronted, he was the prime minister appointed by Bao Dai. And by the way, he was never our appointment, nor was he ever our man. He found that, first of all, the French wouldn't let him use the presidential palace. Secondly, his palace guard, that is his own people the people who were supposed to be guarding him, all belonged to a paramilitary force called the Ben Xuyen, who were gangsters and who had bought the police from Bao Dai for a rumored $20 million and controlled all the gambling and vice in Saigon. And that's how they made their money. And so you had a completely disorganized and dispirited South government in South Vietnam, such as it was. And so I arrived in the midst of this, and without knowing much about South Vietnam, but speaking some French, which I rapidly got up to speed so I could communicate. And the Vietnamese, actually all the way down to, in some cases, the village chief level or down to the non-com level in the Vietnamese army, spoke French as well as, of course, Vietnamese. So I was trying to figure out what it was I was supposed to be doing there. And Colonel Lansdale sent me out to talk to the Vietnamese army, and particularly to something called G5, which under the French system was responsible for troop morale and also for psychological warfare. And I got to know them, and that was the beginning of my introduction to sort of South Vietnamese politics. The slides I'm going to show you will illustrate some of the particular episodes. This is a photograph of a meeting between Colonel Lansdale, Joe Reddick, his interpreter, then Prime Minister Ngo Dinh, a fellow named Wesley Fishel, who was sort of an economic advisor to Diem. And on the left, a Filipino named Valeriano, who was actually in charge of the President Magsay's presidential guard, and who was invited to come over to help Diem form his own palace guard. And this was taken in the early fall of 1954, and they're meeting on the outskirts of Saigon in a very informal way. One of the things that Lansdale did for Diem was, even when he met him, he presented him with sort of an outline of the kinds of problems he thought Diem was going to be facing and some possible solutions. And as a result of that, a bond of trust began to grow between them, and Diem began to listen to Lansdale and also to tell him what was really on his mind. One of the things that was on Diem's mind was the fact that the Ben Xuyen really controlled Saigon, and this is Bai Vien, the Ben Xuyen leader. This is General Hien, head of the Vietnamese army. This is a fellow whose name I forget, but he used to be the titular leader of South Vietnam in some sort of provisional government, but he was actually a French citizen. So was, by the way, General Hien, concurrently Vietnamese and French citizen. This is President Diem. These guys got together and essentially were telling Diem that he had no control, that he had to agree with them as to how to run the country. And the first thing that happened was Hien started planning a coup against Diem. And so a couple of things that Lansdale did to help head off the coup. One was that there was a radio station that the Army took over and began to broadcast anti-Diem statements over the radio. And the guy who was writing the script was actually a Frenchman who was also a stringer for UPI and Agence France-Presse. So he would write these broadcasts, then he would pick up the broadcasts on Agence France-Presse and UP, and then he would read the broadcast back over the radio, or have them read. It was really one of the greatest one-man psychological warfare operations I ever saw. Anyway, this is what Diem had to contend with. And the other way that Lansdale helped diffuse this plot was by arranging for some of the key officers who were doing the planning to go over and visit Philippine nightclubs in the middle of their planning exercise, which then took them out of the country. Anyway, the Hien plot did not succeed. So here I am in the fall of 1954, visiting a place down in the Vietnamese Delta. There's some press people along, including this fellow here, I think works for Agence France-Presse. And we're going into an area that had just been turned over from essentially the North Vietnamese, the Viet Minh, to the Vietnamese Nationalist Forces just to see what was going on there. And this was, I think in September, October, the dry season was already on, and it was really hot on this canal. And these canals go endlessly, crisscrossing the delta down in South Vietnam. This is where that was. Now, what we did working with the Vietnamese Army was to retrain them in how to deal with the civilian population. We took a group over to the Philippines, and they saw how President McSaysay and the defense forces there had actually defeated the communist hooks out on the ground by simply taking popular support away from them. And this army had been under the command of the French and used to either annoying the population, stealing their chickens, or engaging in abuse of the population. This psychology had to be changed if they were going to go into what you see here, which was they were landing in central Vietnam to take over one of these areas that was going to be evacuated by the Viet Minh. In other words, they were evacuating their regular troops. And so they landed on a beach here, which is called Sa Nguyen. What happened was that, I just need to correct something here. Yeah. What happened was that as the troops moved south and they landed at the north of this zone, which is in central Vietnam, which had about 2 million people in it, the Viet Minh had told the population that they were going to be raped and robbed, and the soldiers behaved so well that you started to get a much more friendly reaction from people as they began marching through these villages. They would leave health units behind. You can see somebody here that seemed to be happy. One of the things I pick out, however, is what I think was a Viet Minh cadre who doesn't look happy at all, this guy. And at the end of this operation, this occupation operation was so successful that not a single adverse incident occurred between a South Vietnamese soldier and a civilian. And we had 2 divisions of troops here. And as it turned out, I, as a second lieutenant, was the only person that accompanied these troops into these areas. And one of the reasons was that we wanted to keep a very low profile and not have it appear that the Americans were replacing the French. And so that began, I think, both my close contact with the Vietnamese and some understanding of what was happening in the rural areas and what the problems were. This is me on the left, walking down a street in Quy Nhon, which was the last city at the very bottom of this zone that was evacuated. And it's only notable because this is a fellow named Totan Din, who was highly excitable and a rather brash fellow. He eventually became in charge of the security in the Saigon area in 1963, and he became part of the coup plot against Diem, which, of course, overthrew Diem and unfortunately killed him at that time. Now, this is Diem. About 2 weeks after this occupation operation was completed, Colonel Kim, who was in charge, who is here driving this Jeep, was told that the president was going to come in about 5 days to make an official visit. And he was, you know, this was really a problem because the airfield had to be prepared. He had to somehow inform the civilian population. But the interesting thing is that Diem received a really tremendous welcome. I mean, I was there. This photograph was taken by me. And the reason was that the French were working behind the Ben Xoen to try to take over and kick Diem out and take over the government in South Vietnam, along with a couple of other religious sects. And the fact that Diem had resisted this, which had started a little war in Saigon, was becoming very widely known to the population. And one of the things that I appreciated, and I think a number of us appreciated, was the nationalism of the Vietnamese. They were highly nationalistic. They resented above all the French domination. The French had promised repeatedly independence, but had never really granted it. And now, in effect, Diem was defeating the forces that the French were backing. And this is what I think propelled a lot of popularity behind Diem at this time. That's not a picture you get from necessarily from reading some of the histories, but in fact, that was what was happening. Now, this culminated in a referendum against Bao Dai, who had been supporting the Ben Xoen and other of these sect forces, and basically was under the influence of the French. And so a referendum was called by Diem against him. You will see the vote totals are rather astronomical here compared. This is Diem, this is Bao Dai. What happened was they just overdid it. They took a lot of refugees that had come down from the north. Oh, that was another big problem. There were almost 1 million refugees coming out of the north and coming south, and they had to be resettled. So it wasn't just this internal problem that Diem had. He also had a problem what to do with these refugees. Anyway, a lot of them were bussed into Saigon, and they'd never been registered as voters. And so they ran up the vote. But the truth was that if it had been a completely honest vote, Diem would have won by at least 80%, because the Vietnamese people were fed up with Bao Dai. He was this very remote figure languishing on the French Riviera, and he no longer had, if he ever had, any real connection with his own people. Now I'm going to switch to a later period. So after this exercise, I stayed on in Vietnam, and I worked on something called Civic Action, which was designed to get civilian teams out in the villages because there was a huge vacuum out there in terms of any kind of government. And unfortunately, two things happened. One was that we could not get the regular aid mission to support Civic Action. They were focused on development in the cities, and they came in, I think, with sort of a standard model from the Marshall Plan of how you assist a country on the assumption that the country is already developed. Well, of course, Vietnam was far from stable and far from being developed. The other thing that happened was that the Vietnamese Army, through these actions and then eventually defeating the sects down in the Delta, were responsible for territorial security. But they were taken out of that role at the insistence of the Pentagon and converted into a regular army designed to repel any kind of North Vietnamese regular invasion across the 17th parallel. The net result was that this left a huge vacuum in the countryside. So this went on until the Kennedy administration came in, and Kennedy decided that the situation was so grave that he needed to provide the Vietnamese with support both militarily and economically. And initially, the military advisors arrived and were working with down in the provinces, and we had military advisors for some of the larger regular Vietnamese Army units, but those units had been trained and formed up to do regular warfare. They really weren't adapted to deal with an insurgency. So the war was really been fought out in the provinces, and there was no civilian side to what was then became called counterinsurgency. In other words, there was no economic assistance, no social assistance. The USOM mission had 103 people in it and only 3 people outside of Saigon. So what happened was that I got asked by the Kennedy administration to go out and do a study of what might be done. I was, by that time, in private business. And so I did for a month, and I came up with a program that turned USOM upside down and put provincial representatives out in the province and decentralized funding out in the province to the point at which this was a kind of a joint operation between our civilian provincial representative, the military advisor, and the Vietnamese province chief. So Vietnamese sovereignty over the program was retained, and all of a sudden we began to really do things, and I'll talk about that now. This is a province up in the center, and I'm visiting, and the province chief gets me involved in a ceremony where he's giving out some carbines to, this is the American carbine, to the Hamlet Militia. The Hamlet Militia were people who were recruited locally inside a hamlet to defend their hamlet. And they had just repelled a Viet Cong incursion into that hamlet with a couple of shotguns and a couple of grenades. And so somebody else had provided with some better weapons, but I just happened to be there. And the reason why the province chief is laughing is I think it's obvious the disparity in size between me and this little guy here who wasn't even 5 foot tall. And then this is another typical hamlet in the center. This is a province chief. We're looking at these defenses which were handmade to encircle the hamlet. This fellow was the last civilian province chief, and he really just wasn't up to the job. And so eventually he got replaced. This is a province down in the Delta, and there are Cambodian villages scattered throughout the Delta. That is, people of Cambodian extraction, not just Vietnamese. And here they're armed all with French rifles and a couple of shotguns. These were French rifles from World War I. And, but very proud. A lot of them only had machetes, and they were the self-defense force for that village. One of the things that was necessary, but we didn't always appreciate, were official visits. In this case, we have a couple of people. This is Roger Hilsman, who was Assistant Secretary of State, became quite well known. That's the Provost Chief. That's the Deputy Chief of Mission. Here I am. This is a fellow in the Vietnamese Army who was Chief of Staff for what was called the Strategic Hamlet Program. And this is Colonel Shad, who was the military, my military equivalent in the military advisory group. And we're just out on a typical visit, looking at what was actually happening down in the Delta. Sometimes these visits turned out to be useful, and sometimes they didn't, because you never knew what impressions people took away. And Hilsman had all of his own ideas, and he came away from looking at this whole situation saying, well, it isn't organized well enough. You know, there ought to be one organization that's supporting all of these self-defense elements. And he just didn't understand Vietnam. I mean, that was not going to happen. It might happen sometime in the future. But the notion that you could impose a hierarchical structure covering everything in South Vietnam was some notion that you might get if you were in the State Department or in the Pentagon. But it had nothing to do with reality. This is a photograph of one of our provincial representatives, and right here. And he's giving some medical assistance to a group of Montagnard refugees. The Montagnards are different people. They are Indonesian stock. They live mainly in the highlands in Vietnam. And a lot of them had fled the Viet Cong and had come in and needed assistance. Now, he was not a trained medical person, but we had a wonderful guy in the aid mission in the health department who came up there, showed him basic first aid care, and also came with a license for him to practice medicine that he'd gotten the Vietnamese to issue so he wouldn't get into trouble. I took Earl up there early on, and he wanted to work with the Montagnards. And in this particular province, it had been a new province that had just been created, and there were no living quarters. His living quarter and office was a tent, and he ate with the Special Forces unit that was in this province. And I said, "Are you willing to do this?" And he said, "Yes." And that was a little bit of the spirit of the provincial representatives they had. And I like to liken them to something of the spirit of the Peace Corps, but in a war zone. And so the only danger he said he was really in was that you had to watch out for crocodiles when you went bathing in this river. The only complaint he has was we gave everybody had to go out and live on the local economy. So we gave them a per diem. I think it was about $10 a day. And they took $4 of that away from him because, he was living in government-supplied quarters. Now, we had a number of really tremendous programs, and one of them was a school program. This is a Hamlet school being constructed. We helped supply some of the materials. All these projects were self-help. In other words, the people had to supply the labor, and do the work, and therefore would wind up owning the school. And in 1 year, we were able to construct almost 1,000 schoolhouses. And that was mobilizing the energy of the people down at the local level. We had another program which was supplying pigs for being raised by individual farmers. And that one took off incredibly. We were able to get one boar and 2 sows out to 5,000 families in the first year. And we picked families that were the poorest ones, so they had to rent the land in order to do things like build a pig pen. And we changed 5 traditional ways that the Vietnamese had been raising pigs for 2,000 years. And the reason that caught on was because the Vietnamese saw that, well, if the poorest farmer could do this and make a living, then anybody could do this. And so that was one of, I think, the more dramatic things that we were able to help the Vietnamese do. And I want to emphasize the fact that we weren't doing this. We were supporting the Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese were doing this.
Sir, can I just ask which years you're talking about right now? I mean, these last 2 examples.
Yeah, we're in 62, 63. Okay, I came out in 62 to do that study. Then I came back, and the Kennedy folks asked me to go out and run the program. And I couldn't really turn it down. So my wife Barbara was here, and our 2 small children went out together in September '62. This is another typical project. This is actually an irrigation system that was developed for this village. This is the village chief. This is a Chinese technician from Taiwan who had been there for several years. They were really helpful. And this, of course, is yours truly. All right, let's go back. Okay. Now, that sort of tells you the story of the 62, 63 period. There was another thing that happened, and I'll talk about that shortly, which was we got off to a good start. Counterinsurgency was working, but then the Diem government got itself into big difficulties over the Buddhist affair. And this became a huge problem. And then in November 1963, there was a military coup, which we supported. And we did not support Diem's assassination, but he was assassinated. And after that, things really began to fall apart. The next picture is going to show you the guy who was the ambassador at the time, Henry Cabot Lodge. And Lodge supposedly relied on me for information. And I thought maybe he would also ask me about something about the background of the people that were involved, both on the government side and the military, in this coup that was brewing. So he invited me out to lunch at his house, and he spent 2 hours telling me how he had been the person who selected and persuaded Eisenhower to run for president and then managed his campaign. And there was not one question about what was going on in the local scene, and he had already decided that the only solution was to get rid of Diem and Nu, so therefore we should foment a coup. So I show him in all his glory here. Here he is in 1964 out in the field with Secretary McNamara, and the fellow who pulled the second coup against the original coup, which occurred in November, he pulled this one in January, and that's General Kang. General Kang was very verbal, spoke excellent English, and really knew how to flatter the Americans. And so Lodge just thought he was a cat's pajamas. And later, actually, this photograph was taken about the same time as this one. Now this one shows McNamara on a tour with General Kong raising his hand and saying, Vietnam, Mu Nam. Well, the way he pronounced it, to the Vietnamese, it sounded like ruptured duck, lie down. But that wasn't the only foolishness of it, because here you are doing this out in various locations around South Vietnam. And what you're obviously saying is that this fellow here is our puppet. We own him. And, you know, that just, as the head of the National Liberation Front said at the time, he said, we didn't need to make any propaganda on this theme that the South Vietnamese government was just a bunch of puppets. All we had to do was show this photograph. And they did. So by that time, I was back in private business. I had come back at the end of '63 because my father died, Kennedy died, and Lansdale went back out in '65 at the request of Lodge. Why in the world Johnson appointed Lodge again is a mystery, but he did. And Lodge wanted help with what was called pacification, so he got my boss out there. And the first thing Lansdale did was started talking to people, which was not something that the embassy was really doing. And in order to get some kind of consensus on the Vietnamese side as to what the proper approach to pacification or counterinsurgency really was, he started getting people together informally at his residence. And I came out on a consulting arrangement with state to try to help him periodically. So I was taking about a month off from my business to do this. And so here I am, I'm sitting between, this fellow was a former ambassador to the US named Museum, but at the time, he was a close personal advisor to Prime Minister Key. This fellow here, Wong Van Loc, was the chief staff person for what the Vietnamese had done to sort of continue the Strategic Hamlet program under another name. This was the head of the Agricultural Extension Service, who remained despite the coup and who'd been largely responsible for things like the pig program. So he was a terrific guy. And this is an old fellow from the Philippines named Colonel C.T.R. Bohannon. I could talk a long time about him, but let me say, he was probably the outstanding single expert that we had on counterinsurgency, and he was over there helping Lansdale. So the other thing I did was I went out in the countryside, and here I am in this boat with Bert Fraley, who used to be my deputy in what we call rural affairs in '62, '63, along with a military advisor, and we're going out to see an experimental program planting soybeans in the off-season, and that turned out to triple the income of farmers down in the Delta. And by the way, those kinds of things have continued to this present day. One of the reasons why Vietnam is so strong agriculturally is that a lot of these original ideas just continued despite the North Vietnamese repression after they took over. That, I guess, well, I'll go one more. This was taken in 2002. This fellow named Pham Xuan An turned out to be the top North Vietnamese spy in South Vietnam. And I went to talk to him because I'd known him personally for a long time. This is about 2 years before he died. And we talked over a lot about why he had stayed as a spy for the North. And I think there were two things. One was that he had pledged his loyalty very early on. The other was that despite the fact that he'd come to the United States, he'd been educated in the United States, he worked for the Sacramento Bee as a reporter, Then he went back and he became a stringer and then a reporter for Newsweek and other U.S. publications, was that his mother refused to leave South Vietnam. So he had more American friends than he did Vietnamese. But I think that there was no way that he could have changed his loyalties if he wanted to without something not only happening to him, but happening to his mother. So I think that was part of his motivation. Then I have one more. Now, this is switching scenes. This was taken on the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Kabul in 2009. This is Richard Holbrooke, and this older-looking fellow here, not the person I look like in the earlier photographs, is me. And I was there helping an Afghan civil society effort, which is called the Fair and Free Election Foundation of Afghanistan, in actually manning the polls and checking on the results and all the run-up to that. And Holbrooke had arrived on one of his periodic visits and had just been down in one of the provinces, and so we were chatting about that and what he'd seen. And he told me that what worried him was that we seemed to be doing too much ourselves and we were not involving the Afghans enough. And that is something that we have been trying to get out of, but is a rather typical of the American approach to these kind of problems. We tend to be very impatient. So if something isn't done right away, we tend to think, well, we can get it done, like we can build a school. The problem is that the credit for the school doesn't accrue to the Afghans, it accrues to us. And we're not going to be there forever. So, and of course, you all may remember that he died late in not last year, but the preceding year. And I was his first boss in Saigon. He came out as a young Foreign Service officer. We detailed him with one of our older people to go around and see what was going on. And after he'd been there only 4 months, I sent him down to be the provincial rep in a province, and a difficult one at that. And he acquitted himself extremely well. But he never forgot that experience. He said it was a seminal experience of his life because it made him an action kind of person, a can-do kind of person. He felt that he was what some of us call proactive. In other words, he felt that if you got into a position at state, you were there to accomplish something. And that was very typical of his behavior. So let me turn this off. So I'd like to start with an incident, a couple of things that I think relate or are lessons out of Vietnam, and some of them will be anecdotes. First, I think that we need to understand what kind of struggle this is. And in September 1963, I happened to come back to Washington because my father was ill, and President Kennedy had sent out 2 individuals to try to ascertain whether the Buddhist crisis was affecting how the war was being conducted. And they came back. One of them was Joseph Mendenhall, State Department employee, and the other was Major General Krulak from the General Staff. And they came back with impressions that were so different that Kennedy asked, "Did you 2 gentlemen go to the same country?" And then I was thrust forward to tell the president in about 15 minutes everything I knew about Vietnam. And I tried to explain the situation, I think, in different terms politically, because I knew all the actors. I mean, I actually knew President Zim. I knew his brother, who was the chief cause of the problem. And also knew that this optimistic report that the war was being won handily, particularly down in the Delta, was not accurate. So I took that on because I'd been south of Saigon in one of these provinces where the Viet Cong had recently overrun about 200 hamlets because the troops that would have come to support there were all in the barracks for fear of a coup. And so I started relating this, and I'll never forget that while I was talking to the president, Secretary McNamara was sitting beside him. The whole time he was shaking his head like this. And I just kept talking. Well, that got me into a huge argument, of course, with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, with everybody that was there, and particularly with McNamara, and also directly with Krulak. But I tried to explain that I thought the real problem was New, and that somehow if we could separate New from his brother Zim, that the situation could be changed. And there was one guy who had the confidence of President Zim that I thought had a chance of doing that, and that was General Lansdale, and I recommended the president send him out there. Well, the president said, after I finished, thank you very much, particularly for your recommendation concerning Lansdale. Well, nothing happened, and it was mainly bureaucratic obstructionism in Washington. Nobody wanted somebody out there that they didn't control, and so that never came to pass. So whether that would have made a difference or not, who knows? But at least would have been a try. So the lesson there was that if you want to understand what's happening in a particular country, you cannot just rely on the higher echelons in Washington. You really need to have somebody come in from the field and give you information directly. And, and I still see that as being true today. Another lesson which was not understood, it was understood by President Kennedy, I think, to some extent, but not understood by all of his advisors, particularly Secretary McNamara, was that this was a war about people, not about firearms, logistics, or terrain. And I have a story to illustrate that. When, by this time that McNamara became secretary, Lansdale was occupying a fairly senior position in the Pentagon as chief of operations. So McNamara, shortly after this advisory effort got started, decided that he wanted to evaluate, try to come up with some means of evaluating whether the war was making progress or not. So he was making this chart, and he had all numerical factors on it. Weapons seized, arms caches discovered, Viet Cong killed, and so forth and so on. And so he wanted Lansdale's observations, and Lansdale said, there's something missing. And McNamara said, what? And Lansdale said, the X factor. Well, what's the X factor? Well, the X factor is, what do the people think? What are they thinking? And McNamara jotted that down and then dismissed it, saying, well, there's no way we can calculate this with any way numerically. And so that whole side of the war was just thrown aside, and it became basically a World War II approach, which was men plus money plus materiel equals victory. And of course that carried on under President Johnson. So what came out of that was, to me, one of the real lessons was that this was fundamentally a political war. And we couldn't win it ourselves, only the local people could win it. So you have to help the local people connect in a positive way with the rural population so that you begin to build a cohesive state in which there's a political cause for fighting beyond, in this case, anti-communism. And I think that's a basic rule that continues to apply regardless of whether we're fighting extreme jihadism, extremist Islam. I think we need also for a moral basis to guide some of our actions. Protecting the population, and those of you any of you have followed the counterinsurgency argument at all, know that this has now become the primary effort. But for a long time, it wasn't. And that was true in Vietnam, particularly after we got our own forces in there. The whole idea was to kill enough Viet Cong so they would quit. And that was not going to be possible because you could not follow a strategy of attrition against them because they didn't care how many people of their people got killed. But of course, our people cared about how many of our people got killed. And this was the basic strategy of Westmoreland after we put the troops in. But it was even the strategy that some of the higher military were following early on. It was just kind of a continuum of a sort of a World War II approach to these things. So that protecting population has to come first, long before even forced self-protection, and certainly before the objective to killing insurgents. You never win these wars by killing insurgents. We didn't understand South Vietnamese or Vietnamese nationalism. I talked about that a little bit before. We consistently sort of downgraded the importance of the South Vietnamese, and then of course, once we got our forces out there on the Westmoreland, we ignored them until late 1968, early 1969, when General Abrams took over and he changed the whole approach to the war. But by that time, American support for the war had been lost. We didn't understand the enemy. And what we didn't understand about the enemy was this absolute determination, no matter how many people got killed. And so we started bombing North Vietnam. And the net result of that was that if there was any dissension, and there was some between the population in North Vietnam and the ruling Politburo, that just cemented them together because it was seen as the Americans coming in, replacing the French, and trying to take over the country as the French had ruled it before. So we didn't understand these psychological and political factors. And as General Taylor, when he retired, and this was long after he served in Vietnam, also said we didn't understand ourselves. We had this World War II mindset. We had intellectually brilliant advisors, but we had no understanding of the revolutionary nature of this kind of guerrilla warfare. So I like to quote Sam Rayburn on this one. When Johnson was vice president, he told Rayburn how much he was impressed by the brilliance of all of Kennedy's advisors. And obviously, they deserved to be listened to. They were so brilliant. And Rayburn said, well, Lyndon, he said, I sure wish one of them had run for sheriff once. And another thing coming out of Vietnam is we sure have to have the right people in position for these kinds of very difficult assignments. And I only have to, I've given this thumbnail sketch of Lodge. I mean, he was really arrogant. He thought he understood politics, but he didn't understand Vietnamese politics at all. And so he became sort of a pro-consul. And it's very funny, not funny in the funny sense, But I think we produced a replica of Lodge in Paul Bremer in Iraq. The same kind of arrogance, same kind of ignoring of local political circumstances, and not even wanting to understand, thinking that somehow we can just impose a solution. Also, allied with this, I think, is we have to change a kind of egocentric attitude that we have to a lot of these people that live in what you would call the developing world. We do have a tendency to look down on them, and even though that isn't expressed verbally, in my experience, people in these countries read you, and they read attitudes. And if you're respectful and you're there to really help them, that's one thing. But if you don't respect them, they very easily catch up on that. And so we have to be very, very careful about that. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about Vietnam and Afghanistan. As background, because of the book I'd written, I got called in by some of the people who are trying to figure out what to do with Afghanistan. In particular, a group that General Petraeus had assembled in late 2008, early 2009, to come up with an assessment of Afghanistan and Pakistan and what the possibilities were. And I spent about 5 hours talking about my book to this group, which had civilians as well as military. It had people from the UK. So it was a heterogeneous group. And then I got asked to review informally the report that they were making in regard to Afghanistan, which I spent about 8 hours at the computer doing. And that sort of got me involved in Afghanistan. And so I continued in that vein, and of course, going out there and meeting the Afghans and becoming involved in the civil side of their society and seeing the foundation field some 7,000 observers out in the provinces, most of them recruited not in Kabul, but out in the provinces, gave me a sense that there is a real yearning for a civil society there. And so I was very impressed, and they were both men and women. And the women, I think, were extremely brave because they got shot at, a lot of them, while they were doing this. Anyway, there are obvious differences between the two countries. Culture, history, religion, ethnic divisions. There were some ethnic divisions in Vietnam. There were also some religious divisions between the Catholics and the Buddhists, but that sort of got exaggerated. There was the Vietnamese, by and large, were more literate than the Afghans. And I'm getting an echo here. And there was much more of an existing government structure going all the way out in the, is this easier? Maybe I'm staying too close, too far away from it. There was an existing structure, government structure going out into the provinces in Vietnam, even though it didn't function very well, but at least it was there. So there was a greater pool of talent, certainly, in Vietnam than existed in Afghanistan. But what are the similarities? Well, one of the things that's similar is the basic nature of the struggle. You have a rural-based insurgency in the case of Afghanistan with a religious and political cause. In Vietnam, you had a rural-based insurgency with the quasi-religious, which was communism, and political cause. We had a somewhat inefficient, somewhat dysfunctional regime on our side in Vietnam, Probably not as dysfunctional as the Afghan government, but still pretty dysfunctional. We had uncertain leadership. Corruption was a problem. Also, another similarity is that I would say that if you really measured it, so long as they weren't there directly oppressing people, the Viet Cong were not all that popular in South Vietnam, simply because they used repression. And the population resented it, and certainly the Taliban are not popular in Afghanistan. Their popularity is very, very low. Another thing was, I draw these similarities, the importance of what the local people think, rather than some concept that we tend to bring to the scene, which is I call objective reality. We think that in terms of objective reality is what matters, and these people in Afghanistan, and the same thing was true in Vietnam, think in perceptions. It's their perception of reality that what matters, and we don't tend to understand that very well. And another thing that strikes me about Afghanistan is the importance of events on the ground driving what happens, rather than a preoccupation with policy back here and assumption that, well, if you have the right policy, then something's going to work out. But it as so happens in Vietnam, and certainly happening in Afghanistan, it's actually events on the ground that drive things. And we don't always perceive that very well. And then lastly, I think there's the importance of having the right people. I talked about Lodge, I talked about McNamara. In Afghanistan, the problem in Afghanistan was that we went for 7 years without really doing much of anything. And nobody went south. No security forces went south until late 2005, 2006. And we didn't do that. We turned that job over to the Canadians, who were ill-equipped and ill-prepared, and to the British, who sent a paratrooper down there, a unit down there, and decided that the solution was to kill enough Taliban. Well, the net result was it made more Taliban than it eliminated. So, and we had made big promises, but we pulled out all our troops. We decided we were not going to engage in any what was called nation building. That was McNamara's dictum. And so there was a buildup in the central government, and we turned over really the question of the politics to the UN. The UN built up a huge bureaucracy. We subcontracted out a lot of the training of the police, certainly. We also subcontracted out the construction of roads. There was very little Afghan participation in what was going on. And we made no deliberate effort to try to start building up some kind of Afghan government from the ground up. So you had a tremendous vacuum between Kabul and the rural areas into which the Taliban returned. So it was only, I think, when Obama came in, and it wasn't the initial surge, it was the second surge. We sent out McChrystal, who unfortunately ran into trouble, but he was a good person. We had Petraeus. Now we've got another Marine commander who's quite good, named Allen. But we left in charge Ambassador Eikenberry, and I talked to him. He's a very decent guy. But unfortunately, he sent telegrams back to Washington that got released to the press, in which he was calling Karzai not just an unreliable partner, but in terms that anybody, whether it was Karzai or somebody else, would take a personal offense to. So there was such a gap And that if Eikenberry said, I think you ought to do A, Karzai was obviously going to do B, the opposite. And so that persisted, and only now with the arrival of Ambassador Crocker do I think we had the kind of teamwork there that we had, as a matter of fact, in Vietnam, but it was too late after 1968 between General Abrams and Ambassador Bunker, or in Iraq between General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker. Now we have finally have, I think, a functioning, not just military, but political advisory team in Afghanistan, but it's extremely late. So I've sort of gone through what I thought happened in this interim period and why we ran into such a large set of problems. I might also say, in regard to the training we did for the police, it was absolutely dysfunctional. They were given 6 weeks training, and then they were assigned out, and you're talking about raw recruits, a lot of whom were illiterate, and all of a sudden they were put out in the rural areas as police. What would anyone think might happen? Then it wasn't until 2 years ago that even in our military training, we figured out that literacy was important. So we started giving courses in literacy, so the average Afghan soldier could basically read and write. But for all that time, we've been training up this Afghan army without even thinking about that. So I come to now, I think, the sort of a summation of what are the basic questions here. And those are, what are the chances after 7 largely wasted years, then 3 years of real commitment in Afghanistan of stabilizing Afghanistan sufficiently to permit our troops to, the withdrawal of our regular combat troops. And I'm going to leave aside for the moment the question of Pakistan's military intelligence support for part of the Taliban, question of will negotiations with the Taliban for an acceptable political role be successful, and when will Afghanistan be able to largely support itself? I'd like to answer those questions, or try to, during the question and answer session. So what needs to happen, in my opinion, to have any kind of reasonable outcome? I think, first of all, Karzai has to step down in 2014, as he should under the Constitution, and that a national election be held, and that be reasonably honest. We were going to have to continue with advisors, special forces, logistical and air support, and that's currently being negotiated. We will have to continue with substantial economic support beyond 2014. Some estimates are that for the period beyond 2014, an annual level of U.S. economic assistance has to be somewhere around $10 billion a year. And that's because the Afghan economy doesn't generate enough revenue. There has to be some level of cooperation with Pakistan in holding support for the Taliban. And to me, one of the potential obstacles is whether the Afghans will have sufficient confidence in their own future to continue resisting the Taliban. And I have to say that all the talk about withdrawal, which is mainly directed at the U.S. audience, has not helped us any at all out there, because it's helped to create an air of uncertainty. And of course, that gets exaggerated by the Taliban by saying, well, what that means is they're going to leave tomorrow, so we can just wait them out. And I do think that the administration whichever administration it may be, will have to do a better job of explaining the war, and the American public will have to come to understand that no quick fix is possible. Now, I realize that everybody calls this the longest war, but I question that. To begin with, they set the date of the Vietnam War beginning a bit late. But secondly, if you haven't seriously fought a war, does that count? In my mind, it doesn't. So I really date the serious effort beginning in about 2008. So what are the alternatives? And I know that some question, why are we there at all? And I think the reasons why we are there and why we will probably continue to be there in some form, even though reduced, is, of course, the danger of a possible resuscitation of al-Qaeda. If the Taliban take over the South, they will inevitably be able to take over Kabul too. The North can probably be held because of the ethnic composition of the North, and they are very resistant to any sort of a Taliban takeover. Another worry, of course, is the repercussions within Pakistan itself of a Taliban victory in Afghanistan, reinforcing the Taliban in Pakistan, who are dead set on overthrowing that government. And then you start to be concerned about the nuclear weapons. There's also, I think, the effect within the Islamic world of a Taliban victory, because actually Islamic extremism has been declining in Islamic public support, almost everywhere except in Pakistan itself. And we see that in the Arab Spring. The fact that the Muslim Brotherhood got close to majority in Egypt doesn't mean Islamic extremism at all. They have publicly dedicated themselves to nonviolence, and they have publicly dedicated themselves to working through democratic institutions. And besides, Egypt can't survive without a link with the West. So although we worry about that, I think that the end result of the Arab Spring is going to be more of a liberalization as the younger people take over, who are dead set on an objective of trying to rationalize Islam and democracy. And if that comes off, I think we're basically winning the struggle, but I don't like to see any help being given by what may happen in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And the other question is that if the Taliban think that we're just hell-bent on withdrawal willy-nilly, I do think that that affects the question of whether they're going to negotiate seriously or not for some political space in Afghanistan. I know the negotiations are just beginning, but from the experience that we went through in Vietnam, it takes two sides to negotiate. And the North Vietnamese were very good at holding out and making sure no South Vietnamese representation ever came to the table. And that's going to be the critical question in Afghanistan, because otherwise we wind up just undermining any Afghan legitimacy. And last, I think there is a moral question here. I think we made some commitments to really try to help the Afghan people. And I know it's gotten confused in the fact that Karzai is a less than reliable ally. He's all over the place. His regime is much too corrupt. But I don't think we can blame under the circumstances the Afghan people for that. And so, in my mind, I like to go back to something that Senator Biden said way back in 2002 when he visited a newly opened girls' school in Kabul. And this girl stood up and sort of confronted him and said the following. You cannot leave, she said. They will not deny me learning to read. I will read. I will be a doctor like my mother. America must not leave. In 2001, there were less than 1 million Afghans in school, all boys. Now there are 8 million students, of which more than 2 million are women and girls. So I think we can learn something here between the similarities between Afghanistan and Vietnam. And for me, at least, one lesson involves remembering what happened to the South Vietnamese people after they saw our last helicopter fly away. Thank you.